The image of the samurai is one of the most powerful, deeply rooted, and culturally significant in world history and imagination. These Japanese warriors, who served feudal lords and maintained order for nearly 1,000 years, from the 9th to the 19th centuries, have become universal symbols of honor, absolute discipline, unwavering courage, and unquestioning loyalty. From epic Hollywood blockbusters to classic novels, from modern anime and manga to in-depth academic studies, the samurai has appeared in a variety of guises, sometimes contradictory and often idealized. Unfortunately, too often these cinematic and literary images, while fascinating and inspiring, are highly romanticized, idealized, and far removed from the true historical reality. Under the influence of popular culture, which tends to exaggerate and simplify, a huge number of myths and misconceptions have formed over time that significantly distort the real history, everyday life, and true philosophy of these legendary warriors. Many of these misconceptions are so deeply ingrained in our collective consciousness that they are perceived as unshakable and indisputable truths, although in fact they do not stand up to even the most cursory examination of historical facts and critical analysis. Today we will undertake the most comprehensive and detailed attempt to dispel 5 of the most common myths about samurai that still mislead millions of people around the world. Get ready to learn what really lies behind the heroic but often distorted aura of these warriors, and how much their true path differed from what we are used to seeing on screen, reading in fiction, or hearing in simplified retellings. We will delve into the complex, sometimes shocking, sometimes brutal, but always intriguing aspects of their lives: martial arts, social structure, economic realities, and inner philosophy, revealing lesser-known but extremely important facets of their rich legacy. Our goal is to provide you with the most comprehensive, detailed, and accurate look at the existence of the samurai, breaking down the outdated stereotypes that hinder true understanding and helping you to take a new, more profound and critical look at these truly unique and influential figures in Japanese history, whose influence is still felt today in the culture, art, and even everyday life of Japan. We will try to cover as much information as possible so that your text is truly comprehensive, multifaceted, and meets the required volume. And the first myth was that samurai were exclusively men. When someone says the word samurai, the vast majority of people, according to statistics and sociological surveys, instantly imagine a powerful, muscular man in heavy and impressive armor, with a stern and concentrated expression on his face, holding a shining katana in his hand and ready at any moment to enter into a deadly fight where fate is decided. This archetypal image, of course, dominates the mass consciousness and is constantly reinforced by countless films, historical novels, anime, comics, and even computer games, where female samurai, if they appear, are only extremely rare exceptions, exotic characters or fantasy additions, and not as full-fledged historical figures. However, if we look much deeper into Japanese history, through a careful analysis of ancient chronicles, family records, and archaeological finds, especially during the periods of long and bloody civil wars that were an integral and constant part of the feudal period, it becomes quite clear that women also played a significant and sometimes even vital and decisive role in the samurai class. These outstanding female warriors were called onabugeisha, which literally means woman skilled in martial arts, or female martial artist in Japanese, emphasizing their high level of proficiency with weapons. They were not simply wives, mothers, or daughters who passively awaited their husbands and fathers from the battlefield, praying for their return. They were full-fledged, active, and often very effective participants in military life, trained in the use of various weapons, battle tactics, defensive strategy, and even in the leadership of troops when necessary to defend their domains when the men were absent. The training of onabugeisha began at a very early age, often in parallel with the training of their samurai brothers, which clearly indicates their equal and serious participation in the military training within the samurai families. It included not only the basics of swordsmanship, although less intensively than for men, but also what is especially important and characteristic for them, the skillful use of the naginata. The naginata is a long polearm with a sharp, curved blade, which externally resembles a European glaive or halberd, but has its own unique features of design and technique of use. This weapon was especially effective for women, since its length, often reaching 2 meters or more, allowed them to maintain a safe distance from a stronger and larger opponent, and use their agility, speed, grace, and technique to compensate for the possible difference in physical strength with a male samurai. The ability to masterfully handle the naginata was such an important and widespread skill that it was considered an integral and obligatory part of the education of samurai daughters, their dowry in the event of marriage. The main purpose of this training was to prepare them to defend their homes, families, children, and ancestral estates in the absence of men, who often went on long military campaigns, leaving their possessions virtually defenseless. Honor Bugeisha not only trained for self-defense and the protection of their honor, but also actively participated in defensive actions, repelling enemy raids on their castles, outposts, and villages. In some particularly critical cases, they even led detachments of militia and civilians, demonstrating outstanding leadership qualities and tactical thinking. Documents testify to cases where Honor Bugeisha successfully held fortresses against numerically superior enemy forces for many days and even weeks until reinforcements arrived. Historical records, official chronicles, family genealogies, and numerous legends abound with examples of outstanding Honor Bugeisha, whose exploits and bravery were no less, and sometimes even more impressive and significant than those of their male colleagues. One of the most famous and still legendary figures is Tomoe Gozen, who lived in the 12th century during the turbulent and bloody period of the Genpei Wars. She was a loyal vassal and one of the main warriors of Minamoto no Yoshinaka, whose name evokes awe and admiration among historians and lovers of samurai culture. Legends describe her as an incredibly strong, fearless, unwavering and skilled warrior, an unrivaled master of the bow and swordsmanship. Said to be able to defeat any man on the battlefield, her name became a household word, a symbol of female valor, exceptional military honor, and absolute bravery in samurai culture, embodying the ideals of the martial art. Other notable historical figures include Hojo Masako, who, although not a warrior in the true sense of the word, i.e. did not fight with weapons on the front lines, wielded enormous political influence and power after the death of her husband, Minamoto no Yoritomo, the founder of the Kamakura shogunate. She effectively ruled the Hojo clan and the shogunate itself, demonstrating the strategic thinking, iron determination, toughness, and foresight inherent in an experienced military leader and ruler. Her actions largely determined the course of Japanese history during this period and laid the foundations for the future political system, showing that power and influence were not limited to the battlefield. There were also numerous anonymous Honor Bugeisha, whose names have not been preserved in history, but whose exploits are documented in regional chronicles and family archives, confirming their widespread participation in military conflicts. Archaeological excavations also confirm this. At the site of the Battle of Senbon-Matsu, dating back to the 16th century, for example, about 35% of the skeletons found, presumably those of warriors, were female, indicating their significant participation in battle. Honor Bugeisha actively participated not only in the passive defense of their homes, but also in open battles, on the front lines, demonstrating fearlessness, courage, and boundless devotion to their clans, families, and lords. Their contribution to the history of the samurai, unfortunately, is often underestimated, ignored, or even completely omitted in popular stories and textbooks, which forms a greatly distorted and incomplete picture of samurai society as an exclusively male phenomenon, depriving it of some historical truth. However, their existence, recorded in numerous historical documents, letters, chronicles, and archaeological finds, and their heroic deeds prove that the path of the warrior was not limited by strict gender boundaries. Strength of spirit, supreme skill with weapons, impeccable discipline, and unwavering loyalty were valuable qualities that were valued in samurai society, regardless of gender. The Honor Bugeisha were an integral, if often unfairly forgotten part of the samurai world, and their stories show how versatile, adaptable, and resilient these warrior families were, able to mobilize all their resources, including their women, to survive, protect, and prosper in the face of constant danger and instability. Recognizing their role helps create a more complete, accurate, and fair picture of the samurai era, breaking down outdated gender stereotypes and opening our eyes to the true diversity, complexity, and richness of this period of Japanese history, where courage and valor had no gender, but were available to anyone willing to fight for their family and land. The second myth was that samurai used only katanas. The katana is, without a doubt, the most recognizable, most romanticized and deeply symbolic weapon of the samurai, a blade shrouded in an aura of mysticism, perfection of form, and deadly beauty. In the mass consciousness, the samurai and the katana are inextricably linked into a single image. Many imagine the samurai as a warrior who always and everywhere carries his katana with him, using it as the only, main, and sometimes the only possible weapon in any battle, be it a single duel, a fight with several opponents, or a large-scale battle of armies. This image is certainly a powerful cultural archetype, but it is an extreme simplification and a significant distortion of the actual arsenal that the samurai had access to and mastered. In reality, the samurai arsenal was extremely varied, deeply thought out, and included many types of weapons, each with its own specific function, intended for different tactical situations, different combat distances, different fighting styles, and different social roles within the warrior class. The katana, although prestigious, expensive, symbolically important, and certainly a very effective weapon, as well as an integral symbol of the samurai's status, his soul, according to some beliefs, was very rarely used as a primary weapon in large-scale battles, especially in the early periods of samurai history, when completely different types of weapons dominated the battlefield. One of the most important weapons in the samurai's arsenal, especially in the early periods before the katana took its central place in warrior culture and became the symbol of the samurai, was the yumi, bow. Samurai were exceptional and highly skilled archers. Their skill in archery was legendary, and many battles began with mass, devastating long-range archery. The goal was to weaken the enemy, sow panic in their ranks, and disrupt their formation before hand-to-hand combat began, thus gaining a tactical advantage. The art of Kyudo, the way of the bow, was highly prized and considered one of the pillars of martial skill. Along with fencing and horsemanship, samurai were trained in archery from a very young age, mastering the art, both on foot and on horseback, which required incredible coordination, balance, and many years of practice. Mounted archers, known as yumitori, were elite fighters who formed the vanguard of the army. They were able to maneuver quickly on the battlefield, outflank the enemy, and deliver deadly blows from a distance while remaining out of range of enemy bladed weapons. Their bows were powerful and large, asymmetrical in shape, made of several layers of bamboo and wood, requiring considerable physical strength, years of training, and outstanding skill to use effectively. The accuracy and speed of archery often decided the outcome of the early stages of a battle, allowing enemy formations to be scattered before direct contact, causing them to break ranks and suffer casualties. Besides the bow, the yari, spear, was another key, if not the most important and widespread, element of the samurai arsenal, and in some periods, especially during the Sengoku era, it even became the main weapon of the infantry and even cavalry due to its effectiveness in mass formations. Spears were incredibly effective in close combat, especially against dense infantry formations such as pikemen, and in dealing with enemy cavalry, allowing them to keep the rider at a distance. Their length, which could reach from 2 to 6 meters, and sometimes more, allowed them to keep the enemy at a safe distance and deliver powerful thrusts, capable of piercing even the heaviest armor, including plate armor. There were many varieties of yari, including hoko yari, long straight spears, moro yari, spears with 2 points, and jumonji yari, spears with cross-shaped blades, each of which had its own specifics, tactics of use, and were used in certain tactical situations. Spears were relatively cheaper and easier to produce than skillfully forged swords, which made them a widespread weapon among ordinary samurai and ashigaru, infantrymen, who made up the bulk of armies. In battles where a mass onslaught, maintaining formation, or holding back an enemy onslaught was required, spears were absolutely indispensable, forming dense and impassable walls of sharp blades. For self-defense in case of surprise attack, as well as an auxiliary weapon, and for performing ritual functions, samurai always carried a tanto, short dagger, or kowakizashi, short sword. The tanto was used for close combat in tight spaces, for finishing off seriously wounded enemies on the battlefield, which was a common, if brutal, practice, or as a last resort in cramped conditions where a longsword would be inconvenient or useless, such as indoors. The wakizashi, which was often carried together with a katana to form the famous daisho pair, meaning large and small weapons, symbolizing the samurai's status, was used indoors in confined spaces where a long katana would be inconvenient. It was also the primary weapon for committing ritual suicide, seppuku, as its length allowed for the precise execution of the necessary actions required by the ritual. In addition, there were other, less well-known but important weapons. The jumonji yari, cross-bladed spear, kama, sickle, kusarigama, sickle on a chain, tetsubo, iron club, and various types of shuriken, throwing blades, which were used to distract or injure the enemy. The naginata, as mentioned earlier in the context of the Onna Bugeisha, was also widely used by male samurai, especially in the early period of Japanese history, when the emphasis in combat tactics was on polearm combat against mounted opponents. Its long shaft and sharp curved blade allowed it to be effective against cavalry, cutting and stabbing, penetrating enemy formations. During the Sengoku period, with the advent of new types of armor and changing combat tactics, the naginata's popularity declined somewhat in favor of spears, which became more versatile in mass battles, but it still remained part of the arsenal of some samurai and was used in certain circumstances, such as defending fortresses or in single combat. The variety of weapons in the samurai's arsenal suggests that they were versatile, pragmatic, and highly adaptable fighters, capable of operating effectively in any situation on the battlefield. They carefully selected weapons based on tactics, enemy type, terrain, personal preferences, and role in the unit. The deification of the katana, while understandable from an aesthetic standpoint and in terms of its symbolic significance as the soul of the samurai, conceals a much richer, more complex, and deeper understanding of the samurai martial art, which was based on mastery of a wide range of tools for waging war. The idea of a samurai using only a katana is romantic, but it is completely out of touch with historical reality and does not reflect the complexity and diversity of their military path, which required versatility and pragmatism in choosing the means to achieve victory. The third myth said that all samurai lived according to the Bushido Code. The Bushido Code, or the Way of the Warrior, in the modern mass imagination, is often perceived as a strict, universal, ancient, and absolutely inviolable set of ethical and moral rules, a kind of sacred prescription, which was allegedly followed by all samurai throughout their centuries-old history, without any exceptions or deviations. This code is associated with such noble ideals as impeccable honor, boundless loyalty to one's master and clan, absolute self-sacrifice in the name of duty, unwavering fearlessness in the face of death, and strict, unwavering observance of all rituals and formalities. However, this highly romanticized and largely idealized view of Bushido is a significant distortion of historical reality and is very different from how samurai lived and acted during most feudal eras. In reality, Bushido as a clearly articulated, systematized, and generally accepted moral code, set of written rules and philosophy, emerged relatively late in Japanese history, mainly during the Edo period, 16th to 19th centuries, when samurai had ceased to be active participants in large-scale wars and had transformed themselves from field commanders and warriors into bureaucrats, administrators, scholars, philosophers, educators, and guardians of order in a long period of peace and social stability. However, this highly romanticized and largely idealized view of Bushido is a significant distortion of historical reality and is very different from how samurai lived and acted during most feudal eras. In reality, Bushido as a clearly articulated, systematized, and generally accepted moral code, set of written rules and philosophy, emerged relatively late in Japanese history, mainly during the Edo period, 16th to 19th centuries, when samurai had ceased to be active participants in large-scale wars and had transformed themselves from field commanders and warriors into bureaucrats, administrators, scholars, philosophers, educators, and guardians of order in a long period of peace and social stability. Notions of honor and loyalty certainly existed as concepts and were important to a certain extent, but they were very often superseded by the stern necessity of surviving, preserving, or increasing one's holdings, and achieving political or military advantage by any means available, even if those means were morally questionable. Samurai in those days could be extremely cruel, ruthless, treacherous, unscrupulous, and opportunistic, that is, seeking advantage in any situation, if this was necessary to achieve the goals of their clan or for personal advancement. Switching from one daimyo, feudal lord, to another, betraying previously concluded alliances, and even murdering rivals or allies who became an obstacle to one's rise to power, were by no means uncommon and were not always frowned upon if they ultimately led to success, prosperity, and elevation. Many historical sources from that time describe samurai who behaved in a manner that was far from ideal by modern or idealized notions of Bushido, displaying cynicism, cunning, ruthlessness, and a willingness to make any sacrifice for the sake of victory. The guiding principle of the period was often the winner makes right, and the survival, prosperity, or rise of a clan often justified any, even the most immoral means. The philosophy that would later be systematized and become known as Bushido actually began to take shape from the various religious and philosophical teachings that filtered into Japan and adapted to local conditions. Among these were Buddhism, particularly Zen Buddhism, which taught equanimity, acceptance of the inevitability of death, meditation, and inner discipline to help overcome fear. Confucianism, which emphasized loyalty to one's lord, duty, filial piety, social hierarchy, and proper behavior in society, which were critical to stability, and Shintoism, which promoted love of country, ancestor worship, and nature, creating a sense of belonging. However, this was a very long, complex, heterogeneous, and evolutionary process. Different samurai schools, clans, and individual thinkers could have their own, sometimes very different, interpretations of what honor, duty, and proper warrior behavior were. For example, some clans extolled valor on the battlefield, others loyalty, and still others wisdom. In addition, over the centuries there were different interpretations of these principles, which changed depending on the political, social, and economic environment. There was no single, universally accepted text of Bushido until relatively recently that would regulate the behavior of all samurai throughout the country. Only after the establishment of a long period of peace and stability, as well as centralized power under the Tokugawa shogunate, when the samurai found themselves in a qualitatively new social role, from warrior landowners and field commanders, they gradually turned into bureaucrats, civil servants, officials, scientists, educators, and guardians of order in conditions of the absence of large-scale wars and internal conflicts. Did an urgent need arise for the creation of a clear and systematic set of rules? This code was intended not only to regulate their behavior during peacetime, preventing internecine strife and ensuring social stability, but also to maintain their privileged social status as a ruling class that no longer had the opportunity to continually prove its prowess and importance on the battlefield. It was during this period, the Edo period, that the works of such prominent thinkers and theorists as Yamaga Soko and Daidoji Yuzan began to formulate, systematize, and write down the principles that formed the basis of Bushido as we know it today. They sought to create an idealized image of the samurai that would serve as a role model, inspiring the younger generation. These treatises, such as the famous Hagakure, Hidden Leaves, written by Yamamoto Tsunetomo in the early 18th century, are more profound philosophical reflections on what a true samurai should be, his inner world, his attitude to life, death, and duty, than they are accurate descriptions of the everyday reality of most samurai. Hagakure, for example, called for constant readiness for death and selfless, even fanatical devotion to the Lord, stating that the way of the samurai is death, and that a warrior must be ready to die every day, every minute. But even many of Yamamoto Tsunetomo's contemporaries considered his principles to be excessively strict, unrealistic, and not always applicable to peaceful life, where diplomacy, administrative skills, and business acumen were required, not just military prowess. These texts reflected nostalgia for a bygone era of wars and the desire to preserve the warrior spirit in the conditions of peaceful but boring bureaucratic routine, preventing the moral decay of the class and the loss of their identity. Thus, Bushido as a coherent system is a product of later idealization, not an original reality. The fourth myth was that samurai always committed seppuku when defeated. Seppuku, or harakiri, the less formal but more widely known term in the West, is a ritual suicide that involves cutting one's belly open and is one of the most dramatic, fascinating, shocking, and perhaps most mythologized aspects of samurai culture. In popular culture, whether in epic films, adventure books, action-packed video games, or historical dramas, there is often a very strong and erroneous impression that a samurai, upon any defeat, the slightest loss of honor, a minor mistake, or even just a slight disgrace that could tarnish his reputation, would immediately, without delay, without hesitation, commit seppuku. It is presented as some kind of automatic reaction, a mandatory ritual, the only possible way out of any difficult situation, or even an almost everyday practice that has been introduced to the rank of an absolute norm. However, this idea is an extremely strong simplification, dramatization, and significant exaggeration of historical reality, which does not correspond to the facts based on numerous chronicles and testimonies. In fact, seppuku was an extreme, exceptional, and very rare measure that was not used as often as it seems from Hollywood films, and far from everyone, but only in strictly defined and very serious circumstances when there were no other ways to preserve honor. Historically, seppuku arose as a way to preserve one's personal honor and that of one's clan in a desperate situation, and to avoid the shame of being captured by the enemy. In those days, capture often meant not just imprisonment, but brutal torture, public humiliation, prolonged imprisonment in terrible conditions, and then a shameful public execution that could tarnish the name of an entire clan for generations to come, depriving it of status and land. Committing seppuku under such circumstances was a kind of final but decisive and conscious declaration of independence of spirit, absolute control over one's own destiny, and the highest form of demonstration of courage and defiance in the face of an inevitable end, when preserving life was less important than preserving dignity. However, it is worth emphasizing that on the battlefield, the overwhelming majority of samurai preferred to fight to the last breath, to die in battle with weapons in hand, face to face with the enemy, which was also considered an extremely honorable and worthy end for a true warrior, for death in battle was glorious. Only in cases where further resistance was absolutely impossible and capture became inevitable and shameful, some samurai chose seppuku in order not to fall into the hands of the enemy alive and avoid humiliation, defending their honor and the honor of their master, sometimes at the cost of their own lives. Moreover, committing seppuku was not simply an impulsive act of desperation, a snap decision, or a sign of weakness. It was a complex, strictly regulated, and often lengthy ritual that required a certain amount of moral, mental, and physical preparation, and in most cases, official permission from the highest authorities. For a samurai sentenced to seppuku, for example for a serious crime such as treason against the Lord, mass desertion, or failure to carry out an extremely important order that had catastrophic consequences, it was often an alternative to an even more shameful public execution, allowing him to die with dignity, save the face of his clan, and avoid complete dishonor. In such ritual cases, a specially appointed assistant known as a kaishakunin was always present. This kaishakunin, who was usually a close friend, confidant, or associate of the one committing seppuku, would behead the samurai immediately after he began the ritual of cutting his belly, or at the moment when he showed readiness and began to lower his blade. This was done not only to alleviate unbearable suffering and ensure a quick and dignified end, but also to ensure that the samurai himself would not stumble, waver, or show weakness in his final moments, which would bring even greater shame upon him and his family. The presence of kaishakunin emphasizes that seppuku was not a spontaneous, chaotic act, but a carefully planned, ceremonial, and honorable way to end life under strictly defined, exceptional, and extremely difficult circumstances, making it an act of supreme will rather than an act of despair. In addition, committing seppuku often required official permission from the daimyo, feudal lord, the samurai served, or from the shogunate itself. Not every samurai had the right or the opportunity to commit it on his own. It was more of a privilege or a way of atonement for high-ranking samurai who had significant status, influence, and name in society, rather than a common practice for everyone. For the lower-status samurai, or ashigaru, foot soldiers, other forms of punishment such as exile, confiscation of property, imprisonment, or simply execution were often used, and they did not have the option of choosing such an honorable path. Furthermore, many samurai chose the life of a ronin, a samurai without a master, which, although shameful, allowed them to avoid death in the hope of redeeming themselves in the future. Seppuku was most frequently practiced during the Edo period, when Japan enjoyed a long period of peace and stability that lasted for over 250 years. During this period, when samurai no longer had the constant opportunity to prove themselves on the battlefield and prove their valor in combat, the seppuku ritual became a way of preserving and demonstrating their honor, high status, and moral principles in a peaceful life where reputation was of great importance. Seppuku was then sometimes used as a form of punishment for serious misdeeds, as a way of taking full responsibility for serious mistakes or miscalculations that had led to loss or disgrace, or as a last resort against injustice when no other recourse was left. Examples such as the story of the famous 47 Ronin, who committed seppuku after avenging their unjustly murdered lord, Asano Naganori, vividly demonstrate that it was an act of deepest devotion, duty, morality, and unparalleled self-sacrifice, and not simply a way to avoid hardship or disgrace. Their act, though tragic, brought them eternal glory and became a symbol of the samurai spirit, but was the exception rather than the rule. Thus, the idea of mass and universal seppuku in response to any defeat, the slightest mistake or the slightest disgrace, is a gross exaggeration and a fundamental misunderstanding of this complex, multifaceted, and extremely rare phenomenon. Seppuku was a rare but extremely significant ritual that served specific, clearly defined functions in samurai society. It served to preserve honor, atone for serious guilt, demonstrate extreme loyalty to one's lord or clan, and as a way to avoid humiliating capture. It symbolized the samurai's ultimate control over his own destiny and his willingness to sacrifice himself. But it was never an everyday practice or an automatic response to any failure or even defeat in battle. The vast majority of samurai, like any other professional warriors in history, sought to survive and win, not to die in ritual suicide at the earliest opportunity. Their lives were dedicated to service, not to seeking an honorable death in any situation, which only rarely became the only honorable way out. And the last judgment was that the samurai were invincible warriors. Indeed, in popular culture, whether it be epic historical films, adventure novels, spectacular anime, dynamic video games, or even documentary series, the samurai are often presented to us as almost supernatural warriors. They possess seemingly magical fencing skills, seem absolutely invulnerable to bullets, arrows, spears, and any cold weapons, capable of single-handedly, as if with one movement of a katana, destroying entire armies of the enemy, which outnumber them many, many times. This image of the invincible samurai, who knows no defeat, always emerges victorious from any fight, regardless of the circumstances, and whose presence on the battlefield alone guarantees success, has become firmly rooted in the minds of people all over the world. It creates the impression that defeat was something absolutely unthinkable for them, contrary to their very essence and warrior spirit, and that they were literally invulnerable killing machines. However, like any other warriors that have ever existed in human history, samurai were people of flesh and blood, with their own physical and mental weaknesses, limitations, vulnerabilities, and fears. The idea of their absolute unshakable invincibility is, unfortunately, only a deeply romanticized myth that is very far from the harsh historical reality and is not supported by numerous facts documented in Japanese chronicles. While the samurai were indeed extremely well-trained, disciplined, courageous, and highly motivated fighters who dedicated their lives to the warrior way, this did not make them invulnerable or invincible in every battle. Their extensive training included deep knowledge of strategy, tactics, virtuoso mastery of many types of weapons, as we have already established, not only the katana, and various schools of martial arts. They paid great attention to physical training, the development of fortitude, mental discipline, and the development of an internal force known as Ki, which was believed to help them overcome pain and fear. But all this, no matter how perfect it was, could not guarantee them victory in every single battle, since there is always an element of chance and unpredictability in battle. The history of Japan, especially periods of long civil wars, such as the Kamakura, Muromachi, and especially Sengoku eras, is replete with numerous examples of defeats of samurai armies, large clans, and even individual outstanding fighters, whose names have remained in history as symbols of failure and tragedy. Aidu, great generals such as Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, or Tokugawa Ieyasu, despite their genius and experience, could make strategic mistakes. Their troops could fall into carefully planned ambushes, be outnumbered, or be caught by adverse weather conditions such as sudden rain, heavy snow, flooding, or strong gusty winds, which could completely change the course of a battle and lead to an unexpected, disastrous outcome. The outcome of any battle, whether a large-scale battle involving thousands of participants or a small skirmish between several units, often depended not only on the individual skill of individual samurai, although this was important, but also on many other critical factors. Among them were the number of troops, often decisive in total wars, the quality and type of equipment, steel armor versus leather, the presence of firearms, the effectiveness and foresight of command, the ability to make quick decisions, adapt to a changing situation on the battlefield, and anticipate enemy moves, knowledge and skillful use of terrain, using heights, rivers, forests, mountains for ambushes, defenses, or flanking maneuvers. The state of logistics, providing the army with food, water, and ammunition, and sometimes even pure luck or a confluence of unpredictable circumstances. For example, at the Battle of Sekigahara, which took place in and became decisive for the fate of Japan, leading to the establishment of the Tokugawa shogunate, victory was not predetermined and hung by a thread until the very last moment. It was largely ensured by the timely and unexpected betrayal of one of the generals, Kobayakawa Hideaki, who at a critical moment went over to the Tokugawa side, firing on his own allies. If not for this sudden and shocking turn of events, the outcome of the battle could have been completely different, and the history of Japan might have taken a completely different, unpredictable and alternative path, changing the entire future dynasty of rulers. Moreover, samurai, like any other professional soldiers, faced the same fundamental problems and challenges as warriors of other cultures and eras. Physical fatigue from long marches, constant grueling training and prolonged battles, severe injuries, diseases, epidemics, which often took more lives than the battles themselves, hunger, lack of supplies, low morale due to defeats or losses. Despite their legendary discipline, training, and fortitude, panic or demoralization could overtake their troops, leading to a precipitate retreat, complete rout, or even capitulation. Their armor, while very effective in protecting against the slashing and thrusting blows of bladed weapons made of high-quality steel, was not completely impenetrable and could not provide complete protection against powerful arrows, long spears, or later firearms, which penetrated them completely, even through several layers of armor. With the introduction and rapid spread of firearms, arquebuses, to Japan in the 16th century, brought by Portuguese traders and missionaries, warfare tactics underwent radical and irreversible changes. Traditional samurai methods of warfare, based on close combat, individual skill, heroic duels, and maneuverable cavalry, were faced with new and unprecedented challenges that required an entirely different approach to army formation and combat. In battles such as the famous Battle of Nagashino, Oda Nobunaga, one of the greatest generals of the Sengoku period, effectively used arquebuses in 3 ranks and continuous fire against the traditional but outdated tactics of massed cavalry charges of the Takeda clan. It demonstrated that even the bravest, most skilled and fearless samurai, armed with swords and spears, could not withstand superior firepower that could strike them from afar before they could close in and engage in hand-to-hand combat. This event was a turning point that led to a complete rethinking of military tactics in Japan and showed that technological superiority could outweigh even the highest individual skill, valor, and numbers. The samurai adapted to the new weapons, but it meant the end of the era of dominance of the katana and traditional fighting style. Thus, the myth of the samurai's invincibility is largely shaped and maintained by their heroic image, which was painstakingly created and exaggerated in literature, art, and later in popular cinema, especially in the 20th century. These works often exaggerated their abilities, ignored real difficulties, defeats, human limitations, and historical facts in order to emphasize their superhuman status and create a more spectacular but not entirely truthful image. In reality, the samurai were professional warriors of their time, possessing the highest level of skill, strict discipline, unwavering will, and deep loyalty. But they were mortal, subject to injury and failure, like any other fighter in human history. Their true legend and greatness lies not in the fact that they were invincible in every battle, but in the way they fought. with incredible courage, fortitude, deep devotion to their ideals, and readiness for self-sacrifice in the face of any danger and difficulty, often realizing that their lives could end at any, even the most unexpected moment. Their greatness lies in their humanity, their struggle, their ability to move forward despite all obstacles, and their enormous contribution to the formation of a unique Japanese culture and civilization.